Hi, folks. This is week 3 of uh, the urban experience. And this week we're going to talk about cultivating community and retaining tribal identity um, in urban spaces. I am going to kind of lead up with some shared experiences. So just a heads up, the first part of this does talk about residential school. Um, and so this is an artwork by Emily Arthur. She's a contemporary Cherokee maker. And so this is just to set the tone that a lot of creative Native peoples in urban spaces and outside are reflecting back on Native history and shared experience. And the project of boarding school and re-education was so pervasive and is a shared experience um, for both United States folks and for people based in Canada, that it's really often something that comes up. I mean, it's also a huge historical trauma. Um, and so these images are images of people outside of I think the Haskell School. Um, and Emily has decided to put them back into territory, into the land through that screen print. I'm presuming most people are familiar, but if you're not, let me give you a little bit of backstory here. Um, in a previous week, we talked through different kind of government, federal policies in relation to Native nations and the boarding school era came out of the assimilation kind of policy. And the turn of phrase that really embodied that was Richard Pratt's "Kill the Indian, Save the Man." So already violence is really at the base of this, even though it was put forth as an educational project, right? And even the precursor of the first boarding school, which was Carlisle, um, was established as a prison by Richard Pratt. So he was a captain um, in the army. And so in 1875, 72 Cheyenne people, Arapaho people, Kiowas, Comanches, and one Caddo person, mostly men, but a few women as well, were rounded up and taken from Fort Sill, Oklahoma. They were then imprisoned by military authorities and sent all the way to St. Augustine in Florida to Fort Marion, where they were boarded. They were chosen because they were well-known warriors and community advocates, and they were selected for incarceration because of their previous accomplishments in battle or just their ability to kind of speak to the people and get people ready to resist. They were imprisoned for 3 years from 1875 to 1878 by Captain Richard Henry Pratt. And the Fort Marion space was a prison, but it was kind of his experiment leading up to the Carlisle Indian School. So it was a penal reform and educational institution, and there were barracks. People were forced to do labor. Um, Oddly enough, Pratt also really encouraged creating art, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But so you can see a lot of parallels with the what then became the boarding school experience, especially in terms of assimilation, forced assimilation, could only speak English, had a haircut, were forced to wear uniforms, um, and also the labor aspect, which I'm going to talk about in just a minute. Um, so here are the two stereographs that Emily used prior, and then a just a very well-known kind of before and after photo, and those were popular. Um, and really used as propaganda to demonstrate the quote unquote success of boarding schools, right, to detribalize people. Here are some other contemporary makers kind of reflecting on that experience. Rick Gendron, who we saw in our last lecture, And then these are some images from people who were imprisoned in Fort Marion. And so a lot of those folks came from cultures that had histories of ledger art. And ledger art comes from uh, would a lot of times be plains nations that would be traditionally uh, visual culture kept on winter hides, so on bison hides, kept on winter counts, so on bison hides or other kinds of hides, but bison primarily, and they would be a way to keep record within the community. And there was a very specific kind of flat representational style that was often used. It made the most sense on that medium. When the bison were targeted and hunted almost to extinction, right, that resource was stripped from communities. And so then people were resourceful and they would take ledgers from, let's say, their community Indian agent, or they'll like um, post, just when settler colonialism was imposing itself upon Native peoples, there was a lot of documents and a lot of papers, and those papers that were then recycled by Native artists, and they would draw in the style of their winter counts on them, and that was ledger art. And so this is kind of a facet of that. These were storytellers, story keepers, and artists who became imprisoned. This is work by Zodum, who was a Kiowa story keeper, and he kind of got noticed by Pratt and some of the people who were running Fort Marion. Um, and then Pratt had this idea of, oh, well, if you all, as prisoners, can continue this art style and then you could sell it to tourists as like native art, then you could um, raise money for me. So Pratt really encouraged people imprisoned at Fort Marion to make this work and then really pressured them to sell. Um, Luckily, many of their uh, records do still survive, and they showed the reality of the experience in the prison, right? So, uh, also forced to attend church services, and that's kind of the space. And because of the, again, importance of this kind of shared history of boarding school, of imprisonment, of assimilation, even if maybe your relatives didn't go to boarding school, but they experienced it in a different way. This is something that many uh, Indigenous people continue to reflect on, and especially within the creative arts. So this is a piece centering Zotum's work, but it's by Jolene Rickard, placing that back into the context of the land and continuing to tell that story. Of course, the we knew about the pervasive experience of boarding schools and residential schools, but in June of 2021, there was the unearthing of 215 graves at Kamloops residential school, and several community members and art makers, reflected on that great loss. Of course, it was known by families, right, that if their kids didn't come home, um, then there was a loss, but it might not be, they might not know, where their relatives are laid to rest. Many people didn't know that that these people were at the school. And it just speaks to the really harsh conditions of living that happen in those spaces. This is Johnny Bandura to imagining the kind of future lives of all 215 students, young people. And this mural has since actually changed, but there's an Indigenous artist collective based in Tucson called Wagon Burner Arts, and they uh, made this mural talking about the MMIW crisis. And actually, they were painting the mural in 2021, and as it was happened, Kamloops information came out, and so they added in Canada the Day of Remembrance as Orange Shirt Day, and that's for survivors, but also for people lost to the residential school system. And so they used orange there and have this little spot of remembrance that they worked into the mural. Um, so like I said, that kind of shared experience. First of all, we talked about MMIW last week, and I wanted to kind of flesh that out, but also that shared experience plays into urban communities today as well. Um, Not just urban communities, but it is particularly a factor because of the residential schools outing program. So it was a specific labor program, or they would call it an apprenticed program that emphasized assimilation, and it was free labor for white families. So children were given to white farms and households. In 1900, more than 1,000 Carlisle students a year were working through the outing program. It was also a way to stop students from going home to their families, right? So if they were forced to continue into white spaces, then they couldn't go back and, practice their language, reaffirm their relations, uh, learn their stories and their customs. Instead, they were being funneled into becoming domestic workers or manual labor workers. So this didn't even start being addressed until 1978 with the passage of the Indian Child Welfare Act. So this is very recent history, and it was a program that endured for a long time. And the Indian Child Welfare Act, ICWA, uh, supports Native parents' legal right to deny their children's placement in off-reservation schools. And here we have this is still within the Haskell Indian School, but this is prepping people, especially young women, for the outing program to do be seamstresses. Here are some other archival images of where then they would be placed. And so the outing program took all children, but it was particularly um, impactful and targeted at women and girls. And so it placed them in low-wage domestic positions, often in white homes, especially in cities like LA, San Francisco, Albuquerque, Carson City, Phoenix, and Tucson. Um, and actually, in Phoenix, the Indian school couldn't keep up with the demand for domestic workers because they were paid below market wages. So we have records that in the summer of 1898, well over 100 teenage girls worked for local families, all not being compensated their worth, and all, ostensibly forced through the boarding school system. Um, of course, that's not to say that the system was taking advantage of them, of course, but individually and as groups, there was a lot of resistance. And so these domestic workers did rebel against labor exploitation in many ways, including going through the system and filing reports with the BIA to note the conditions of their work and register their objections. For example, one outing matron in Tucson complained about the young woman she placed in white households as domestic workers, saying they seem to forget they are servants and deliberately live up and deliver. Excuse me, deliberately up and leave people without any reason whatsoever. So even this matron who was overseeing the program, her complaints about her students having agency supported the complaints that were filed of these workers as being treated as unpaid laborers, as forced to be servants. Um, yeah, so those reports tell their side of the story. They detailed exhausting and demeaning work around the clock. Domestic workers were responsible for cooking, serving meals, doing laundry, ironing, cleaning the house, and caring for children. So they would basically live in servants and they were completely at the will of their employer. Um, and this was again, so pervasive that starting in 1920, domestic workers in Tucson started to meet with employers in advance of accepting a job to judge for themselves whether they were going to like the lady or not. Because also, because they were domestic employees, it was kind of the women who were in charge of overseeing them. And, if they were going to be cruel, or, they just wanted to vibe them out. So, two historians who you could look if you want to research more into this, are Victoria Haskins and Brenda Child. And Haskins uh, really has done a lot of research in the Tucson area, so that's particularly applicable. When these meetings would happen, these workers would also then negotiate for wages and workload before they accepted the job. Of course, that's not to say that those negotiations were always upheld, but it is, obviously an important display of agency. And so you have the boarding school system and you have the outing system program, which then placed a lot of, especially young women, into cities as domestic workers. So that was part of contributing to urban Indian centers. Um, then you also have this history of the federal government as they were assimilating, making ceremony and dance illegal. So in 1882, the US government ordered all Indian commissioners to abolish indigenous customs, including traditional dances. Dancing was the first crime named in the US Court of Indian Offenses in 1883. Then feasts and ceremonies, and particularly potlatches, were also targeted. The consequences to still engaging in your customs could include physical punishment, imprisonment, and withholding of rations, so also starvation. I would mark that all of those are crimes against humanities, as recognized by the UN, but this has not been recognized by the UN. Um, uh, Dances, of course, are central to enforce community, culture, relations, and also they're a display of power, right? The community power. So that's part of why the reason that they were so threatening to colonial enforcers and why they were targeted so hard. Then there was also this kind of Christian moralizing narrative of thinking that the dances were immoral, and that played out in a gendered way where, especially, they were concerned about women's honor. Um, and a lot of these dances did, by empowering Native people, explicitly resist colonial influence. In particular, the creation of the ghost dance. The whole purpose of that, as it was gifted in a dream, is to go against settler colonial regime. So of course people resisted, and dancing continued in complex tactical ways. Um, but it kind of had to go underground or kind of mask as another event. Until some of this legislation was repealed. Um, and then following World War II, you've had a lot of folks deployed, especially Native folks deployed in global contexts, traveling, going to new cities. Then you have the relocation program. So folks are feeling more comfortable or just are more populated in cities. And you have the rise of the American Indian movement activism. And so you have this reclaiming of tribal identity, and a recognition of this history of not being able to practice their dances. This is kind of the flourishing of intertribal powwows, which are central to community continuity. Um, and here's some art pieces that tell parts of this story. This is Marie Watts, and this is a Hudson Bay blanket that she has embroidered to reflect this historical photograph of a Coast Salish potlatch being held. And there it is in space, so you can see the size. Um, she works a lot with blankets and fabrics and also uses jingles. And so she's thinking about, maybe you all are familiar with, she's thinking about dances, she's thinking about ceremony, blanket dance, jingle dress dance, and the ways that blankets circulate through community as objects imbued with social and cultural importance. And how they facilitate and maintain community stories. Um, and uh, to also just make clear the kind of AIM movement, which you could say kind of began in 1968, and Russell Means, Dennis Banks, Clyde Bellecourt, Vernon Bellecourt, and John Trudell are kind of the main players. You think about the 60s and you think about the rise of activism for several marginalized groups. You can think about the Black Power movement, the Young Lords, and so feminist advocacy in full swing. So there was a lot of moving to the streets, and so the American Indian movement was definitely a part of that. And a lot of it had to do with publicly reclaiming identity, not only land and territory, but then also those cultural components, the ability to gather and to dance. And a big reason why it came about in the time that it did, not only because the 60s were kind of um, socially fomenting a lot of marginalized groups, but also it was because of the presence of people in urban areas with those shared experiences of the federal government taking lands, doing boarding schools and taking children out of their homes, and then also banning a lot of cultural expression, that you had people that were confined in many ways, had shared experiences of confinement, and then were able to get together and organize and express their power and resistance. So this is an AIM drum and some amplifiers, and really interesting because these are just like artifacts of a cultural moment that have been exist within the Museum of the American Indian, the Smithsonian Museum of the American Indian's permanent collection. Um, Oh, I'm sorry. This is very much out of order, but this is another piece from that collection. And this is a ration check. So when we were talking about how rations would be withheld from people who were continuing to practice their culture, um, this is the check that would be taken away in that instance. And a really interesting kind of merging of experiences where that Czech lived in this very beautiful beaded Lakota bag that then has the metal cones um, adorning the bottom. And it's that kind of support that then got yanked during the termination era, which I talked about 2 weeks ago. And so that, in addition to the long histories of oppression, all set the stage for the American Indian movement. And I think probably the most visible expression of AIM was the occupation of Alcatraz. And so we're going to watch a brief video on that. This is really cool, stretched hide declaration of the return of Indian land that goes through kind of the claims, the AIM claims to Alcatraz and talks through why they were doing what they were doing. And here we're going to watch this.
The island of Alcatraz. Alcatraz is a moment of inspiration. It was an intertribal movement that garnered national attention and that brought about policy change that affected our people. It's the gold standard of activism.
I think it's about time this government starts recognizing that we young people like to take over our own destiny.
What was special about Alcatraz and also Standing Rock and Wounded Knee was that they were moments where the rest of the world actually was forced to look, that other people had to pay attention to our story.
On November 20th, 1969, a group of indigenous activists occupied Alcatraz Island, claiming it under the banner of Indians of all tribes. Lenata means warjack, one of the first Native American students at the University of California, Berkeley, and 23 years old at the time, was one of the leaders.
The occupation of Alcatraz is just to visibly put ourselves out there to take land back because this country is our country. And the island is native land. It belonged to the Ohlone people.
The federal prison at Alcatraz had been abandoned since 1963. So the occupiers invoked the Treaty of Fort Laramie, signed in 1868 between the United States and the Lakota Nation, claiming that it allowed them to seize federal land that was no longer being used.
It was enough for the students to see that a treaty was being broken. So it was just enough to get us all ready to take Alcatraz.
This is a starting place for all American Indians to rally around.
On the island, Warjack was a key strategist and one of the female voices in the leadership. Richard Oakes, a Mohawk activist and San Francisco State University student, became the face of the occupation in the media.
We wish to be fair and honorable in our dealings with the Caucasian inhabitants of this land, and hereby offer the following treaty. We will purchase said Alcatraz Island for $24 in glass beads and red cloth, a precedent set by the white man's purchase of a similar island about 300 years ago. We know that $24 in trade goods for these 16 acres is more than was paid when Manhattan Island was sold, but we know that land values have risen over the years.
We appointed our governing leadership. We actually had an election, and from there we established who was going to cook the food, who's going to bring the food over, who is going to be on security, who is going to help with the children, who is going to teach the children.
The Indians seem to be picking up a lot of support. They have received several $1,000s in cash and foodstuffs.
Television news coverage spread the story of the occupation around the world. It drew attention to the occupiers' demands to end federal policies like forced relocation and the termination of tribal rights.
We will become an international outlet worldwide for authentic Indian art. And this will establish our base income to run the island and our university.
Warjack wanted to set up a Native American Studies Center on Alcatraz to teach more accurate American history. She had successfully pressured Berkeley to establish the first Native American Studies curriculum a few months earlier.
It was all colonized studies. They don't want to be confronted with the fact that this country was based on genocide of our people. So we wanted to initiate programs to talk about our truths and our histories.
Plans for the future were being laid. But then, in January 1970,
Tragedy has come to Richard Oakes, the leader of a group of Indians now squatting on the abandoned prison grounds of Alcatraz. His 12-year-old daughter Yvonne died today of injuries suffered 5 days ago in a 3-story fall while playing among the prison buildings.
Richard didn't want to stay out there. It's really hard to lose a child. And so he went back, and then we just kept working, just move forward, keep going.
soon media coverage turned negative. Negotiations with the federal government broke down, power was cut off to Alcatraz, and living conditions deteriorated.
What is the situation now on the island?
Well, we have a considerable cache of canned sea rations, but then we don't have any fresh fruits, vegetables, or meat or milk. We don't know how long we'll be able to hold out food and water wise, but we're going to hold out there as long as it takes to maintain our occupation.
There was a lot of negative press always saying bad things about us, you know, how we were a bunch of wild Indians, I guess.
Federal officials today recaptured Alcatraz Island from that band of Indian holdouts who invaded the island 19 months ago.
The occupation of Alcatraz ended in June 1971 with the forced removal of the last 15 occupiers by federal agents.
They are shotguns and clubs.
And what did they say? What did they say they were doing?
They just said that we all have to get off the island.
But the protest did bring change.
When we were on Alcatraz, surprisingly, President Nixon was very supportive of us.
President Richard Nixon persuaded Congress to pass a series of bills that ushered in a new era of tribal sovereignty and self-determination for American Indians.
I trust that this will mark one of those periods in American history where, after a very sad history of injustice, that we started on a new road to justice in the treatment of those who were the first Americans.
It's hard to overstate how important the Alcatraz occupation was, but it really was a starting point for the Native rights movement in the United States and beyond. It was kind of like the Montgomery bus boycott of Red Power and the Native rights movement.
Following Alcatraz, Native activists organized further protests and land-based occupations. The Trail of Broken Treaties in 1972 to occupy the U.S. Bureau of Indian Affairs, a standoff at Wounded Knee on the Pine Ridge Reservation in 1973, and the Longest Walk, a 5-month cross-country march in 1978.
To be Native was to be, in a sense, an activist, to have this responsibility to carry forward, something that we shouldn't have to protest for, which is the recognition of our rights, the upholding of the supreme law of the land as they're described in the Constitution, our treaties, and to continue to practice these cultural ways and beliefs that have been on this land since time immemorial.
In 2019, Julian Brave Noisecat, who grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, helped organize a canoe journey to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the occupation of Alcatraz.
The idea was that these canoes would circle the island and help reclaim the island as a symbol of Native freedom, self-determination, and sovereignty. 18 canoes came and participated, including an Ohlone Thule Reed boat, an indigenous craft from the area, which went all the way out to the island and touched the island on that day. It was the only craft to actually touch the island, which is really cool. And the event was covered in a lot of the local media, made it into the New York Times. The action of reoccupation of land becomes a theme after Alcatraz, of course, all the way up to Standing Rock.
Thousands of people gathered at Standing Rock right now trying to stop construction of a massive oil pipeline. They're concerned.
In April 2016, the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe began a protest against the Dakota Access Pipeline, saying it would contaminate the water supply, harm sacred sites, and violate treaty rights.
Just like everybody else, I went to Standing Rock to support the people there. I ran into a lot of people that I knew, even the children and grandchildren of those who were on Alcatraz.
It was about environmental racism and injustice, and it was really sort of one of the most visible Native protests in American history.
So right now we're behind a small barricade. More and more people are gathering along this line.
Native activists were on the front lines of the 10-month-long protest, reporting and shaping the narrative for a massive audience on social media, as the local police used pepper spray and water cannons on the crowds.
Images of Native activism are empowering. Whenever you think about how Natives have been portrayed, whether that's in a Western movie or in the history class, it's in a state of victimization and belittlement and loss. But when you can see yourself in a positive way and a power building way, you're no longer a victim.
In the end, the Trump administration allowed the pipeline's construction to go forward, but the Standing Rock movement had a resounding impact. 2 years after taking part in Standing Rock, Deborah Holland, a member of the Laguna Pueblo from New Mexico, became one of the first two Native American women ever elected to Congress. She would later become the Biden administration's Secretary of the Interior.
A major development in the long-running standoff.
Weeks of media coverage and an avalanche of support for the Standing Rock tribe on social media proved that contemporary stories of American Indians could go mainstream.
It's because of that instance, we started to see an uptick in an interest in Native storylines and Native characters.
And Hollywood was paying attention.
Are you Crazy Horse or sitting?
No, I'm not one of those awesome guys. No, I'm more of your
Standing Rock activists were involved with the creation of the critically acclaimed television series Reservation Dogs, the first show to be completely written and directed by Indigenous creatives.
do it here.
I really feel like we're on the brink of a reckoning.
So better man.
Like, you can't tell stories about us without us. It's going to change the way that non-Native people see Native peoples, but more importantly, it's going to change the way that Native people see themselves. Representation is activism.
Alcatraz as a prison represented man's inhumanity to man, and we had to change that. We had planned and envisioned so much to happen, and it did happen, but in different ways across the country. It's been a long fight, and it'll continue.
All right, so that was helpful. You kind of got to see that information pulled full circle with the connection to Res Dogs there if you chose to watch that for our humor week. Sorry if you could hear my dog furiously digging at his bed during that. Hopefully you couldn't. And so then out of relocation and AIM activism and people coming together and being visible in cities, you have this big rise of Indian centers and friendship centers. Friendship centers do exist in the US. In Canada, they also are pretty prevalent. We're going to watch a little video about them, and it's a Canadian video, and that's why I think they're more prevalent in Canada. And in particular, I've seen them linked with Métis communities, and I don't, because I'm not Canadian and I'm not Métis, I don't totally know if there's a distinction between a US-based friendship center and things across the border. But they both spaces are this response to an influx of communities in urban areas and these places were developed by community to help community, and that's really central. They often function as spaces for supporting cultural, physical, emotional, and spiritual well-being. So they can include recovery centers for people who might be struggling with addiction. They often intersect with art making. While there may not be a big studio facility, there are usually makers in the community, and they might have bead groups. Bingo is a big part often held there, especially for elders. Love going to bingo. There's also an emphasis on youth in a lot of these centers. So a lot of youth events, mentoring programs, just making sure that the youth feel supported and feel connected. And again, in supporting that like cultural and emotional and spiritual well-being, they often host or partner with. So I know up here in the Portland area, there's a weekly, at least in the summer, there's a weekly, and then they have a couple events in the off season. Native Market, and that organization partners with a couple of different Indian centers across the state, and then some organizations that help support youth who are interested in farming. And then they also, as well as holding the weekly market, they'll also partner with host communities if there's going to be a powwow or a dance or something. So that's really big spaces of convergence. Here's a couple of people speaking on friendship centers in the context of Canada, but this is the best I could find.
Hey, Leah.
Hey, Phelan, how's it going?
Good. And hello, listeners.
Hello.
Hello. If you've been listening to our podcast for a while, you know that we do these mini shout out episodes between our main feature episodes.
Yes.
But we wanted to switch it up this season and to, make things a bit different.
We got a change is the only constant thing in life.
Exactly.
So we are changing it up.
Yes, we are. And we are doing something called crash courses. So what we're going to be doing is sort of a rapid fire history lesson on topics that we find super interesting. It'll be basically a quick look into things that we want to know more about and that we think people should know more about too.
It's like a bridge history bites that you don't have to take much time to digest.
Yeah, exactly. For our first one, I thought we would look at something that's really close to many Indigenous people.
Okay.
And that is the Friendship Center.
Okay. And basically, this is good because you're going to be telling me about friendship centers. I know almost nothing about friendship centers.
I saw you look through the Rolodex of things you know about friendship centers.
Actually, nothing.
Yeah. Okay. So in many cities and towns across Canada, you'll find friendship centers. Sometimes they're called Native, Aboriginal, or Inuit friendship centers. And these are urban organizations. They're hubs for many Indigenous people when they first arrive in an urban center.
Okay. See, already just with the name, I thought more like old Indigenous people playing bridge or something.
Yeah, I don't know. Bridge, more bingo.
Bingo.
Anyway,
Okay.
So
no, that is
they're important for a number of reasons. They can help those who are new to the city find housing and connect to other people and culture, and they can tell you any number of things about the new city that you might be living in.
Nice.
Yeah. And so I think I've kind of taken these spaces for granted just because they've always kind of been there. So I wanted to learn a little bit more about them.
Okay.
All right. So the roots of the friendship centers can be traced back to the 50s.
Okay.
I didn't know that
they're,
either.
They're pretty old.
Yeah.
I mean, new and old.
Yeah.
Kind of. Yeah.
And so why that is because after World War II, many Indigenous people were moving to urban centers to find employment and opportunity. And many veterans who had lost their status as a result of enlisting in the Canadian Forces could no longer live on their reserves. So they had no choice but to move out of their communities and to urban centers.
Wait. So, oh man. So you sign up to fight for Canada.
Yeah.
And as a result, you lose your Indigenous status, which basically means that you can't live on your own land.
Yeah, exactly. And so you would have to find another place to live. So many people would come to the city. Many veterans would come to the city and then they would end up living on the streets or were homeless. And so a friendship center became a really important place for these people arriving in the city.
Man.
Yeah. So this wasn't the case for everyone, right?
Okay, right.
Other Indigenous people had left their communities due to lack of economic opportunity. Some had been moved to urban areas for further education after residential school. Others had moved from their communities when they had been relocated to hospitals, sometimes called Indian hospitals, to recover from tuberculosis.
Right.
Yeah, because the stays at those hospitals could
forever.
be years.
But I'm also assuming some people just moved to the city and were like, I need a place to land,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Like it wasn't right.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Because at this time, this is when the pass system, which we talk a little bit about in the Indian Act episode from last season, this was starting to become defunct. So you had more mobility of Indigenous people. So more people were ending up in urban centers.
Right. Okay, gotcha.
So in the 50s, you see places like the North American Indian Club in Toronto, the Kokalitsa Friendship Club in Vancouver, and the Indian and Métis Friendship Center in Winnipeg all starting up. And many of these places started as volunteer-run grassroots social clubs.
Like community. It started with community. Yeah.
And so this really helped for these newly arrived Indigenous people to the city to sort of also deal with racism, right? Because that would have been a pretty prevalent thing at the time.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because it makes me think of our episode on Chinatown and how a lot of Chinatowns started really in Canada because it was just about let's stay together to kind of have community to protect ourselves from racism.
So much about exactly. So much about that. And so a lot of these spaces when they started up, they didn't really have a, physical building. So they would utilize church basements or the YMCA or the Salvation Army or even old rooming homes, like basically anywhere they could.
Right.
And, at this time, they had to be funded by volunteers. because the Canadian government was focusing their funding towards people on reserve and in their communities. They didn't really want to sort of push any funding towards urban Indigenous people.
And I'm assuming they didn't really want to encourage outward travel into urban centers.
Yes.
I wonder, were they kind of trying to discourage that?
I think so. I mean, I can't say for certain, but it definitely looks that way.
Right.
But by the 70s, there were already like 40 friendship centers across the country.
Cool.
Yeah. So the National Association of Friendship Centers was started as an umbrella organization to sort of, house these things under one banner. And so there are now in this country over 100 friendship centers across the country, from Prince Rupert to Happy Valley. And each of these centers, they offer language classes and counseling, traditional healing. You can join a drum group. You can learn to beat, and there's services that help you navigate the city. Yeah. And there's always like tons of social activities going on.
That's nice.
Yeah.
No, that's nice.
Yeah. And I mean, when I moved to the city, it's the first place I went. Me and my stepmom drove to the city.
Nice.
Went to the Native Canadian Friendship Center on Spadina.
Yeah.
Went in and asked the front desk about housing. And they pointed us in the direction.
That's lovely.
And so I think, that's what's important about these places, I think, for me, is that no matter where you come from, in most major Canadian cities, there is a place where you can land to feel that sense of community.
This is a feel good. I love this.
Yeah.
Yay. Friendship
Yay.
centers.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, that's nice. Okay, well, this is our first one.
That's our first crash.
And on from here, who knows what we'll cover next? Because we don't. We're going to research it and let you know.
So that was really helpful, hopefully, in establishing a little bit about what these friendship and community centers are about and their origins. And you will be reading this week, or you have already read, some pieces that really emphasize the role, especially that women have played in that. When I spoke with Dr. Lobo, the professor who made this class and wrote the book on this subject, that was something that she just kept emphasizing, at least in her experience in the Bay Area, that it really is women who are the leaders in those community centers. And lastly, I just wanted to think through some other ways that Native representation and urban identity have been tied together. This is Brian Union. He's Denizah, and he became quite famous for making some traditional designs of Denizah masks out of some very non-traditional, very urban aesthetic things like Air Jordans, or this is like a whale skeleton made out of 2,000 plastic chairs. And then he also uses some more traditional materials like tanned hide and stretched hide, but making them into different kind of spaces and shapes. And we are going to watch a segment where he talks about his work here.
I didn't grow up on the coast. I really like being by the ocean, but I like to go visit it and then go away again. When I lived on the coast, I was very influenced by the artwork of the First Nations on the coast. And I was interested in how something very specific, like the coastal motifs and imagery, moved to being something that was really associated with the whole province. I had heard that the last killer whale was leaving the Vancouver Aquarium, so I wanted to go film her. And that's when I kind of stumbled upon what used to be the big industry, the whaling industry on the West Coast. The imagery of the whale was pretty widespread across maritime native cultures. When I made the first one, all that kind of came together. Working with those chairs, I left enough clues that people could tell what they were. You can buy those chairs anywhere, and they're cheap. Kind of switch that happens, that's the spark, right? That gets people interested. If you ask any native Indian person, where are you from? They wouldn't really say the city they happen to be living in. They would say where their blood relations are. Well, I'm Daneza, so that is a very specific part of the country. But I moved to Vancouver when I was 18 to go to art school. And that was the first time I lived in a city. I love the opportunities and the culture around you when you're in a city, but I prefer to live out here. It's nice to see all this sage blooming. Eh? My childhood was spent on a really large cattle ranch. So when I was a little kid, I would spend a lot of time out in the forest with the dogs. They were kind of like my guardians. Ed's a Northern Alberta mutt. He's the boss of this place in some ways. Like, we all listen to Ed. So yeah, that's across the road there. Those pastures are part of the property. And up there in the hillside. And up there too. My ancestors were promised they could either live on reserve or they would be given land. But none of it was honored. When I started working with shoes in the 90s, I went into Nike Town. They had sneakers of theirs in glass vitrines, and I thought that was so strange. I started to make connections between the commodification of those shoes and the same thing that's happened to native art. And then there was just a kind of a strange coincidence that the color schemes and designs look very similar to Northwest Coast masks. There was this kind of illicit thrill I got by buying these Air Jordans and like immediately starting to kind of cut them up and stuff. So, yeah, and that was my first kind of foray into making objects. I'm a pretty quiet person. I was kind of raised in around cowboy culture, so there's a lot of aggression, but it's not really how I approach the world. That's correct. So I didn't have much access to culture growing up in the North, so I had like one television station, AM radio kind of thing. My folks died when I was 7, so I just kind of like buried myself in my imagination. I used to make artwork because I thought I could hide behind it. And that turned out not to be the case. My artwork became so tied up with my identity, especially as Native Canadian, that it was almost impossible to talk about my artwork without my identity. An uncle of mine showed me how to make drums years ago, and I'm not a very good musician, but whenever I'm home, like my cousins will kind of thrust a drum at me to like participate, and it's great. I love it. But I wanted to make some of my own. I've always also really liked modern furniture. So I kind of used those chairs to make these drums, give them a life other than utilitarian furniture, right? Kind of give them a voice. Yeah, I like vehicles. I have a nice Impala now. It's my summer car, really. Cruise around in that. When I was adolescent and into my 20s, I had to figure out who I was and kind of come out of the closet. But that's really not an issue anymore. I think gay culture is kind of mainstream. And I never really fit into that stereotype, anyways. My family are hunters. It's very common in Canada. But a lot of my family have freezers to keep moose meat in. And a lot of the times they're outside. I was visiting family and I started making these temporary sculptures and sticking them on top of the freezers because they were like the perfect pedestal. And I liked kind of seeing that, like, some people would just, they thought, oh, like, who put all this crap on here? And other people, they would look at it and say, oh, that's an artwork, right? So I decided to take that into the studio. I like using things people can recognize that they see around them every day. This new series I just started, it's going to be shown in Vancouver in January. I wanted to revisit the material. It's been about 10 years. And I wanted to do it in a new way. When I first made them, I was just kind of slowly taking them apart piece by piece. And now I just much more fluid with it. Oh, these are like kind of horns. I work very intuitively. We just tighten everything up and then start cutting and see what happens. Like, I don't have an idea of what it's going to look like in my head, so it'll be finished when it feels finished. You know, I always say to myself, I'm not going to work like this anymore, and things are going to be done weeks ahead of the opening. But I guess a part of me still likes the kind of intensity of working down the wire.
This will be attached. Have you figured out how that's going to work?
No.
No. No.
So, yeah.
And hope for the best.
I wanted to make these ones more abstract. I think when I made the first ones, I was interested in referencing them to what people thought Native art is. Now I've kind of moved away from that. And some of these just feel like 20th century modern sculpture. I'm involved in a contemporary art community that is very exclusive. Well, there's all different sorts of art worlds. There's a whole Native American art world. I kind of have a bit of a hand in that. If I hadn't gone to art school, if my parents hadn't died, I probably would have wound up working on the family farm and making art in secret.
Right. It's always in my way. Good golly. There we go. Sorry. Now I need you to move again. I just can't believe. I don't know what this little annotate doodad is on Zoom now, but it is always in my way. My gosh. Just too much junk in this platform. Okay. So I thought that was interesting, how Brian was talking about his experience, and it's kind of the inverse of what this class is looking at, but he did have that urban experience. Someone whose work is relatively similar in that she works in assemblage too, and speaks about her mixed background being Black and Native is Natalie Ball. So I just wanted to show some of her work as well. When I go missing, Queen of Spades, also thinking about intersections of gendered violence that both Black and Native women experience. And she's also extremely involved in Klamath land claims, and removing the dam and restoring the land. So a lot of her work deals with that as well. Of course, Klamath is a pretty rural community in Southern Oregon and Northern California. But her work weaves in first of all, it speaks to an urban audience and it weaves in a lot of urban aesthetics. Excuse me. Um, so that's it for this week. You got some cool videos. Didn't have to listen to me as much. And stay tuned for next week.